In this video, we're going to be discussing Underdog's newest weekly winners contest and the methodology that I'm approaching the contest with as I do more and more of these drafts. So first, you have to understand how great your lineup has to be to actually win one of these weekly payouts. We're not talking about scoring in the top 5% of the pool. We're not talking about scoring in the top 3, the top 1%. You need to be in the top half of a percentage point. So not the 1%, the top half of the 1% to get that weekly cash out. So that's the most important thing that you have to realize. That your lineup has to have the week of its lifetime to actually get a cash out in one of these weekly winners pools. Now, because of that has to heavily impact your draft strategy. It can't be like your regular Bestball Mania, or, average 12-man winner across the season takes it. First off, to be in that top half a percentage point of weekly lineups, you are almost, let's say 90%, 95% of the time, you need to have at the least a top 5 QB finish for the week. And that's being generous. Most of the time, you're probably going to even need a top 3 QB finish on that week, unless the rest of your lineup really just goes off. Okay? But I think top 5 is a good barometer, a good benchmark that you need that if you're going to place in that top half a percentage point. So QBs, which I don't think most people realize this, QB is of great importance in this contest. And current ADP does not reflect that at all. With QBs, there are 2 routes that you can take. So the main approach that I'm taking, which we'll discuss more later, is just hyper-loading on week 1 right now. The other, if you are trying to build, a team that can pop off any given week in the season, you need at least 2, good QBs. And then even a third that can have a stack. To get in that top half a percentage point, you're going to need a top 5 weekly QB finish, and more likely than not, a stack along with that quarterback that blows up in a given week. Now, as I've done more and more of these, I've started to realize I don't think building for a full season is a great methodology for this contest right now, but I don't want to, shy away from it. Always take the value in these drafts, but let's discuss kind of the specific approach that I'm taking. So I am, as I said, hyper-loading on week 1 of the NFL season. It is impossible. We all know this with Bestball. It's impossible and regular. It is impossible to predict the entire season of the NFL, right? Even more so, it's harder to predict what weeks your lineup is all going to align to click together, right? In Bestball, you do have the benefit of your best lineup being played every week, but again, you have to be in the top half of a percentage point to cash in this contest. Your lineup has to, you can't just have one player blow up. Your entire lineup has to blow up, which makes solely playing for week 1 pretty valuable. This doesn't mean that your roster can't also cash in another week, but for the most part, we have one given, and it's week 1. So let's hyperload on that week, find the best matchups, the best players, the best point totals for week 1, and stack that lineup. So with that, let's discuss, first of all, the highest point totals for week 1. Now, the 2 biggest ones of note, the one, honestly, really great for this strategy because it's going to support long-term value in this contest as well, is Kansas City versus the Detroit Lions. That game's going to be happening on Thursday of week 1, and it has the highest point total of week 1 currently at 54 points. The next closest is Miami at the Chargers at 50 total points. And the rest of the kind of field is pretty close to tightly together. Only a couple points here or there. The next top three just around at the top five would be Dallas at the Giants, the Bills at the Jets, Cincinnati at Cleveland. The major games that you're going to want to avoid with this strategy are going to be San Francisco at the Steelers, Arizona at Washington, and Tennessee at New Orleans, because they have the lowest point totals at 40.5 for the Arizona-Washington game and the San Francisco-Pittsburgh game, and 41.5 for the Tennessee at New Orleans game. The rest of them, I wouldn't focus too harshly on it, right? I would mainly just kind of key in on Lions and Kansas City Chiefs players, secondary, Miami, and Chargers. Also with these top four, Detroit not so much, but they could take a major leap as an offense this year. But KC, Miami, and Los Angeles all are great season-long teams too. So that was the point I was making earlier. Even though we're hyper-loading on week one, your team is still going to provide some solid value. So, similarly, while we are going to be targeting those high point totals, just because a player doesn't necessarily have a high point total week one doesn't mean that they don't have a great fantasy matchup. So I would like to go through, just based off last season, some of the great matchups at each position. So at quarterback, Russell Wilson has a great matchup against the Raiders, who were the worst against opposing fantasy QBs last season. Second would be Jared Goff against the Kansas City Chiefs. Third, we have Green Bay facing the Bears, Carolina facing the Falcons at 4, and then Minnesota facing Tampa Bay at 5. As for quarterbacks we're going to want to avoid, we're looking at Mac Jones playing the Eagles, the worst defense for QB to face fantasy-wise last season. We're looking at Jimmy Garoppolo against the Broncos, Daniel Jones against Dallas, Josh Allen against the Jets, and once again, Kenny Pickett against the 49ers. For running back, the best matchups are Chicago against Green Bay, Miami against the Chargers, Carolina at Atlanta, Washington versus Arizona, and Cincinnati at Cleveland. As for who you want to avoid, we're looking at Najee against the 49ers, Philadelphia running backs against New England, New Orleans running backs against Tennessee, Cleveland backs against Cincinnati, and Derrick Henry versus the Saints. Now, with wide receiver, I'm a little less focused on it because more so what kind of fantasy strength of schedule for wide receiver indicates is most of the time kind of how much the depth receivers, play well. Because we're looking at the entire position group. At quarterback and running back, it's much more focused on the starter. Whereas for wide receiver, it could be that, the Colts can't cover slot receivers, not necessarily that the wide receiver one is going to do great against the Colts. So I wouldn't focus too much on fantasy matchups for the wide receiver category. Obviously, still keep them in mind, but I wouldn't put as much of a hyper focus on them as I would with quarterback and running back. For wide receiver, I'd be more looking at that point total. But these are still indicative of maybe some late round dart throws that could be good week one. Those being Jacksonville Jaguars receiver core at Indianapolis, the Giants versus Dallas, Carolina at Atlanta, Jets versus Bills, and New Orleans versus Titans. Now with that last one, I'm still probably avoiding most New Orleans wide receivers because of the low point total week one. As for who we want to avoid, it's surprisingly the Chargers against Miami, but the high point total kind of conflates that. So again, put all this into account. Don't take any one of these variables as, the must focus thing. Like, these are all kind of just part of the formula we're building. They're not just, the end all be all at each one. We have Vegas wide receivers at Denver, also another one to avoid. Bills at Jets, Bears at Packers, and Titans at Saints as the other wide receiver groups that don't have great matchups week one. Similar thing with tight end. A little bit more indicative than wide receiver, but again, I wouldn't put too much focus on these. But tight end matchups that are good. We're looking at the Chargers versus Miami, so Gerald Everett is a great late round tight end dart throw. We're looking at Dallas at Giants and Philly at New England. As for the ones we want to avoid, Titans at Saints, Giants at Dallas, and Jets at Bills, or versus Bills. Apologies. But again, the main thing that I'd be focusing on is that load up on KC versus Detroit and Chargers versus Dolphins week 1. By loading up and stacking on those two games, we put ourselves in the best position to hit value week 1 and get a cash and profit off this contest rather than, wishing and praying that our lineup is going to kind of just snap off altogether 1 week later in the season. I don't want to downgrade that strategy because I think it can be very viable, taking someone like Kyler Murray late and getting a stack with some Cardinals players as a secondary, easy to build stack on top of taking, another higher end QB stack, QB wide receiver stack, and then you have 2 great stacks to work the season with, and you fill out the rest of your roster. I think that can also work really well, but I think, the best opportunity you have here is to stack week 1 with these 2 pretty prime matchups that we have here. That said, I wouldn't hyper focus on these stacks, right? Like, you need to be targeting these matchups, but you don't need to be reaching heavily to take Kadarius Toney over another wide receiver that has value, right? Like, don't completely violate the season-long opportunity you have by reaching completely for week 1 out of value, right? We're targeting these players within valuable parameters so that our team, just collects all that value week 1 and then can potentially maybe provide some value later on in the season, which is honestly something that I struggle with, right? Like, as soon as I'm taking Mahomes or Herbert, I feel the urge to just stack as many of the receivers as I can with this team so that I'm in the best position week 1 to snap off on that value, right? So it's definitely something that even I have to work on because the stack feels so alluring. But sometimes we're better off just, taking someone else, even though obviously if Mahomes performs week 1, his receivers are going to be performing too. So that's the methodology that I'm taking with this new contest. Obviously, there are still some valuable players and teams that I didn't mention here, right? So Carolina had the 10th best matchup for opposing running backs, and Bijan is likely going to get a lot of volume out the gate. But I didn't really mention Atlanta as a prime running back matchup week 1, especially because they have that low total. But, their lower total is also indicative of a game that'll likely be closer throughout most of the matchup, which means Bijan should never run into a horrible game script week 1. While it isn't, very enticing that he's going to be he's going to be getting a lot of touchdowns, that the Falcons offense is going to be really slinging points, he likely won't face a negative game script, and because of his volume, he's still an attractive option, right? So you have to kind of pair all these things together. I'm going to put all of these matchups and point totals in the description below so it's easier for you guys to have on you when you're doing these drafts yourselves. But as I said before, use this approach. I just wouldn't take it to the full extreme where I'm losing value by taking Chiefs, Chargers, Dolphins players. Like, you can get a Dolphins stack at great value in most of these drafts. Like, that's why this is working right now, because you don't have to reach to get these stacks. So those are just my thoughts. That's the methodology that I'm taking with this contest. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and if you think that this is a viable strategy to just hyperload on week 1 in this contest. Thanks, and best of luck in your drafts.